Buying or selling a tenanted property in Ontario could lead to a lot of headaches, especially if you don't know how to properly navigate the process. And truthfully, it's always better and less risky to buy a home or to sell your home without a tenant in the property. But sometimes the perfect home comes up that has a tenant in it, or for one reason or another, an investor has to list a home for sale that has a tenant living in it. If you're going to be buying or selling a home in the future and might find yourself on either side of a transaction involving a tenant, then this video is for you. Of course, this is not legal advice. You're always going to want to consult a lawyer or a paralegal before you move forward in the process, but in this video, I will do my best to explain things you should know and some of the situations that you might come across when you're buying or selling a tenanted property. My name is Jessie McClellan, and I'm a realtor here in Oshawa, Ontario. I make videos all about moving to the Durham region and keeping you informed on everything that's happening in our local real estate market. And I also make videos like this with tips to help future buyers and sellers. If that sounds good to you and you find this video helpful, then subscribe to the channel and hit that like button to help me reach more people like you. One of the first things you need to know is, does the tenant have a signed lease agreement, or are they currently month to month? If there is an existing fixed-term tenancy agreement between the seller and the tenants, it will remain in effect. A change of ownership on the property does not cancel a lease, even if you as a buyer intend on making that home your primary residence. When you buy the property, you are assuming the tenant, their lease, terms on their lease, and the current rental rate, which should all be disclosed to you and put on the APS. You or the current landlord can ask the tenant to leave, try to have both parties sign an N11 and both agree to end the tenancy, but they are not obligated to leave. And you would need to wait until the term on the lease agreement is over before you're able to move into the property, assuming that all of the necessary notices and timelines were adhered to, which can all be found in the Residential Tenancies Act. If the tenant is on a monthly tenancy agreement, then there would be no fixed term and no need to wait, but you would still need to adhere to all of the timelines and notices set out in the RTA. The best and most common route for a buyer would be to request vacant possession so that it shifts the responsibility onto the seller to work with the existing tenants and come to an agreement to end their tenancy. The seller with a firm deal from a buyer in place may on behalf of the buyer give notice to terminate the tenancy if the buyer or their immediate family plan on moving into the property. I would also recommend that if you are purchasing the property with the intent of moving in and taking vacant possession, that you stagger your closing dates with the date the tenant is leaving. So if the tenant's leaving on the 31st, take possession minimum of 5 days later. This will allow you to do a final walkthrough of the home after the tenants have left and before you close on the property to make sure that everything is as expected. By not trying to line up a closing date too close to when the tenant will be vacating and allowing yourself a buffer, if there are any issues, you'll have more time to deal with them. And of course, making sure that you're protecting yourself in the clauses that are being put into the offer. But even with doing all of that, there are still some situations that can come up. Even if they were served the N12, which is the notice to end the tenancy because the person purchasing requires the unit, the tenant can decide to fight the notice and remain in the property until the hearing date is set. If the tenants are not cooperative and do not move out on their previously agreed upon date, this can cause all sorts of issues. The buyers could refuse to close on the property because they aren't getting vacant possession. The seller could be forced into negotiating with the tenants and paying them to leave to allow the property to close. It can turn into a legal battle if not handled correctly by both the buying and the selling sides of the transaction. And when a deal does not close or is delayed, it can often set off a chain reaction of events. The seller could be relying on those funds to close on their next purchase, causing them to be unable to close on their other deal. And the buyers who are ready to move in and have either sold their property already or given notice to their landlord may find themselves with a moving truck loaded and ready and nowhere for them to go. This is why you might also want to file the L2 with the landlord and tenant board after giving the N12. As part of the application, you'll need to provide proof that the N12 was given in good faith and that the buyer of the home will be moving into the property, usually done by obtaining a sworn affidavit from the buyer. However, once the application is accepted, the LTB will schedule a hearing, and during the pandemic, the landlord and tenant board hearings were backed up to the point that cases were being delayed for 12 to 18 months. And even now, they're usually between 5 and 10 months, which would be an awfully long time to wait for vacant possession. This is why something like cash for keys has become increasingly popular. For tenants with a lease agreement in place and who are not violating the terms of their lease, it's about the only option a landlord has to get them to end their tenancy early and vacate the property. With landlord-tenant board hearings being delayed for so long, even month-to-month tenants who were legitimately served notice that the buyers were moving in are negotiating cash for keys in order for the seller to avoid potential lawsuits if they're unable to provide vacant possession for the buyers on closing day. This is one of the reasons why it can be so risky for an investor to sell their property while it's tenanted, regardless of the terms of the tenancy agreement. And to add to that, if you do successfully serve a notice that the new owners will occupy the home, and then the tenant finds out after they leave that the new owners did not occupy the property for a minimum of a year, and that they instead put it back up on the market as a rental unit, those tenants can sue for damages, and you can be fined from the board as well, sometimes costing tens of thousands of dollars. And they don't go after the buyer, they go after you because the seller is the one that served the notice and it was in bad faith, even though you, the seller, may have had no idea that the buyer was going to do that. So as a seller, if you were selling a home with a tenant in it and the buyer requested vacant possession for the purpose of living in it themselves, I would 100% have the buyer sign an affidavit that would say what their intention is, regardless of if you will actually be filing an L2. So in the event that the buyer doesn't move into the property and instead rents it back out to someone else, you have more protection, or at least would have the ability to go after the buyer if the tenant came after you. As the seller, you also have to consider the fact that tenanted properties tend to sell for significantly less than vacant homes do. Of course, it depends on the type of home and neighborhood, but it's not uncommon to be $30,000 to $80,000+ less. Other investors or buyers in general don't want to take on your tenant. You might have the best tenant in the world, but investors like to vet their own tenants and know exactly who they're renting to, especially if the current tenant isn't paying market rent. They're not going to pay full value for a property if they're taking on extra risk and less than market value for rent. So when you sell your property with a tenant, you're cutting out a significant portion of buyers because average families usually don't want to deal with the headache and risk of a tenant not leaving, and investors don't want to take on a tenant who they don't know that could be paying below market rent. And the only way either of those types of buyers will buy a tenanted property is if it's such a unique property that nothing else is out there, or if they feel like they're getting a really great deal, better than they would get with a vacant home. One thing I've been seeing a lot more frequently on MLS that I think is a mistake is investors leasing a home to someone and then immediately following the home being leased, they're listing it for sale. Now, I'm sure there's a reason for it. They might be upside down. They might need the home lease to help carry the mortgage until it gets sold. But the reality is, if you sell it vacant and price the home correctly, it will allow you to sell the home for a lot more money and sell it much faster because it will appeal to more people and you can ask and accommodate for a quicker closing. And I know some sellers may think that because they've leased it, it's worth more to an investor, but that's usually not the case at all. Experienced investors are going to want to do their own due diligence with selecting tenants and preparing the terms of the lease. Another important factor in a transaction involving a tenant is, does the tenant want to stay in the property or do they already have somewhere they're moving to? As a seller, you'll want to have this conversation with your tenant and include them to some degree in the selling process. And you'll also always want to ask your tenant to leave for showings. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't agree to it, but you never know what they might say to a potential buyer, especially if the tenant does want to stay. They could try and turn away potential buyers. I've been to many showings where the tenant refused to leave and will follow us around telling the buyer about all of the bad things about the home. And usually after they get done telling us all the issues, they tell us just how much they would love to stay there. And truthfully, sometimes you can tell it's on purpose, and other times I don't even know if they know that they're doing it. They're just a family concerned about having to relocate or pay higher rent somewhere else, and I completely understand that. But on the buyer side, sometimes it is really nice because walking through a home with a tenant, you can ask them questions and they will usually have a wealth of knowledge about the property and neighborhood, so you can get the inside scoop. But you do always have to try and get a read on the tenant and their situation. Are they being honest, or are they just trying to deter you from buying so that they can continue to stay there? And if a tenant is being forced to leave and they're really unhappy about it, it's possible they damage the property and or leave a lot of mess to clean up. Now, the seller should have it all cleaned out, but it doesn't always play out that way, especially if the possession date is only a day after the tenants move out. Again, why you want to leave a buffer. If you're buying a tenanted property, hope for the best, but be prepared to fix holes or repaint, hire cleaners, and maybe even junk removal services once you take possession. And one last thing both buyers and sellers should be aware of when involved with a transaction that includes a tenant is making sure that offers are not including anything that the tenant owns. I know that probably sounds obvious, but sometimes a tenant actually owns some of the appliances and is planning on taking them when they vacate. So make sure you're aware of what the tenant owns and do not include it in your offer or accept it in an offer because it can create an avoidable headache on closing day. You don't want to be expecting a washing machine that's not going to be there on closing day, nor do you want to be paying for a washing machine because you didn't realize it was your tenant's. That's it for this video. If you have any questions for me, be sure to leave a comment or you can book a call with me directly using the link in the description. Hit the like button if you found this video helpful and subscribe if you'd like to see more like it and to stay up to date on everything happening in our real estate market. Thank you so much for watching until the end, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.